Welcome to the February 19th OpenZFS production user call. We have Andrew, Rob, Jan, Patrick, Eva, Alexander, and myself, Michael. And while slightly off topic, I sure wish Illumos had an unset PPT devs feature in the loader, which maybe is there but is not documented. That would remove pass-through devices, PCI pass-through devices, when experimenting with Beehive and Illumos. I spent some time on that last week. The whole team here is trying to find the quite accurate zVault IO link. And I'm kind of back and forth with JT on that. So let's see where that takes us. And that's what's linked from the web page. Thank you for checking that, Patrick. And I couldn't help but notice a comment this week going through MakeFS, where I've been chasing down a bug that might be fixed in head. Let's see, that would have been Mark Johnson said, the set of properties we handle grows too much. And if it does, we should use libzfs core, I believe. Maybe I can find a reference to that. So I've been mildly scarred by Rob's conversations and your discoveries, Jan, that libzfs core doesn't do a whole lot. You have a path to add a few things specific to, I believe, clones, but looking at the long term, I mean, what does our wish list include, and what is practical in a strategy that doesn't hold
So,
back developers yet gets a nice easy access to ZFS and all the things. Go ahead, Jan.
so first of all, even an unstable API is useful.
You are cutting out. Are you on a
Let's.
train as per tradition or tramway?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
I'm not, but I'm on a phone.
Ah, and welcome, Greg. Try that again. Uh, Greg, do you have any topics?
Not today, sir. No,
Nope,
thank
no
you.
worries. Hey, no worries. Okay, go ahead, Jan. Try that again, and I'll look for that link.
I wonder how is the makefs command even implemented, because it is normally for UFS that they kind of re-implemented most of the basic UFS stuff. I don't think they re-implemented a writable ZFS implementation. Are they using userspace ZFS? Are they just using the normal ZFS in the kernel? And then, because that wouldn't work without the right privileges. So, how is that implemented?
Correct. I believe it's a bit
Or did they
homegrown, but
really be implementing ZFS?
I will
Like
dig
a
up that comment.
write only, write once mode? Because it would be possible. In that case, none of that would apply. And on the other hand, MakeFS is in the base system in FreeBSD. So if you check out the full base repository, you have all the headers in there, and as part of build world, it will work. It's
And
just that basically you can only use it in build world.
and that's what led me down that path,
You
was
can't
remembering
use
that
it in
you
the
said
port.
BEADM uses it built into the base OS, so it gets that with free
BECTL,
of charge.
only BECTL does. The other one was, I think, written in shell
Hmm.
first, and then we written in. For the
So,
original shell script version, it wasn't an issue because it invoked the ZFS commands.
yep.
For the C version, it kind of works because it also uses the real libzfs directly too. So it needs all of that to use that, which is not intended to ever be a stable API. But we should still, as FreeBSD, install all the headers you need to build against it, even if it is an effectively unstable API, at least in theory. And just tell people that, yeah, this is an internal. We have other private libraries. We could rename the library to libzfs, lib private ZFS or whatever to
Hmm.
make it clear, or just say there is no non-private libzfs. Deal with it.
I mean, I'm not sure making a libzfs private is necessary. I mean, the whole point of ZFS core is that is a stable API, which inherently implies that the main libzfs is not.
Yeah, exactly. But FreeBSD has taken some common libraries like libucl and has a private version of that, which is called libprivateucl, so that there isn't a name collision in the file system, so that you
Okay.
can have both in your linker path and identify them by name. And it's a hint that if there's private in the library name, maybe don't expect it to be a public API. Don't expect the.
Did we lose him or we lost me?
No, he's
Okay.
cutting out somewhat badly,
He was indeed.
unfortunately.
I'm sure he'll be back. He's been loyal. So looking at that tree, uh, I see things like simple, and let's hop into the first cfs.c, and there's a directory of its header files and goodies.
Yeah, I know a little bit about
You poked around it,
MakeFS.
Rob. Go ahead.
Background sorry. Yeah, MakeFS. The ZFS support in MakeFS is like standalone. It implements just enough ZFS to be able to create a plausible file system. It does have a couple of bits of ZFS code in its source, but it doesn't link with anything, and that's part of the reason for a little while. I think you saw that in the bug tracker, Michael. It was possible to create file systems that ZFS could not import because there were very subtle differences. So at the moment, yeah, it's its own thing.
And not unlike
Um,
the loader, which, to its credit, only has to read rather than write,
yeah, that's right.
and then grub.
Yeah, it's not very hard to make a good file system. Sorry, make the on disk structures for ZFS. They're not that complicated. It's constantly updating them and
Right.
performing well. That is all the hard stuff. So yeah. And
Have
then
you?
Let him
as
finish.
to libzfs core, like to me, it kind of doesn't matter that things don't support things right now because we'll add what we need and we'll add what we want as we go, right? I don't actually think there's any. I get a little bit baffled on this call, only very little bit, by I guess how much we talk about how it might not be fit for purpose and all sorts of stuff because like ultimately it's just like use cases. We'll add what we need. There's no particular developer impediment that I can see,
I see.
which
That's
is why I've been starting to ship little patches and trying to get things improved very, very slowly. It's all just time and motivation, I think.
Test, is my audio working now?
yes, we can hear you much better.
Okay, so I think that comment about using libzfs when it has its own re-implementation, even if it is a append only one, is a red herring. It does not apply. Neither libzfs nor libzfs core can talk to a custom re-implementation because they would have to provide a character device to do it, which would require them linking against queues for BSD, which they don't. To do it from user space. If you really wanted to do a lot more complicated stuff, it should probably be re-implemented against user space ZFS instead of shipping its own custom re-implementation. That would take care of all the on disk format compatibility. And a way to do that in a more structured way, but which does not exist as far as I know, would be to have it basically use something like Fuse or something, and then you could make it a character device, but that would require at least some privileges to load the kernel module and to set the permissions on it so that the server would be available. Or you would have to do the equivalent of Fuse over whatever Unix socket or whatever. Yeah. Or you make it an internal API and just call the relevant functions from to write instead of porting it to be an API server, it would be an internal API then. But yeah, that's just an implementation choice.
Yeah, look, it might be a misspeak, and it meant libzpool, which is the user space
Oh,
implementation.
and is there an official one, or I've seen them over the years, but that may have been how it first got on Linux. But is there an official user space zpool within the project?
Um, uh, Sort of.
Go.
No, so it depends what you mean by official. So libzpool
Being the tree is a
is a
good
real
start.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, libzpool is a real thing. It's what is under the tools ZDB and ztest. And it is a complete standalone user space. Like we literally compile the source twice, once for the kernel, once for user space.
Oh, got it.
The thing that's missing in libzpool is a like any kind of operating system kind of connection. So like a file system hookup or a zVault hookup, because we don't have those in user space as such. So the interface that you get is like the internal, like the SPA functions or the DMU functions or the whatever, the ZAP functions. So you can use that to build a real file system, but like it's the same thing. Same thing as you'd expect from like using ZFS properly. You have to define a pool, and then you have to create it or import it, and you have to, you point it at either files or real, like block device dev nodes,
But
however they're expressed on your platform.
But making this libzfs into a proper view server could be quite useful for data recovery, because you wouldn't have to crash a real host system.
Oh, absolutely, it is. In my work at Clara, we have an internal tool which is exactly this, which we use for our recovery contracts. It uses libzpool, and it basically scans the entire. It walks all the on disk structures, builds up a kind of a knowledge base of everything it can find that is in good shape and in bad shape, and then uses all that knowledge to try and piece things together to find useful bits of data, and then writes it out to another file system that you already have there. So it doesn't recreate a file system, but it tries to get your data back, and it does that with zpool. So that's an internal tool. It'll never see the light of day. But it definitely supports that assertion that, like, yes, this is a massively user space ZFS is like massively useful.
What did the Rust guys use to make use of ZFS from user space in Rust, as demonstrated in last year's?
I don't know, because it's been demonstrated in like there's been like 2 or 3 presentations about something like that, and I imagine to do anything more than the most trivial thing, you'd have to be. You'd have to be using.
Let him finish.
zpool. You'd have to be using libzpool, but I haven't actually looked at that, because I just haven't got around to it yet, and mostly because I have my own opinions about how to make user space work. So it's kind of been
the other thing which would be quite fun to see is, instead of used to have a user space NFS server talk to libzpool instead of a real file system.
Yeah, there's been a few. There have been prototypes over the last 10, 15 years of doing things like that, putting in an NFS server, putting in a 9P or a IOFS server, so you can directly mount your file system direct into your VM that way, and you don't have everything in the host system kernel. Putting a web server on it, putting a HTTP server on there.
Maybe S3 compatibility.
Yeah, sure. That would also be nice to, and has been proposed multiple times, to have a new data set type of an object store instead of a file system.
Yeah.
I know that it has been argued that would be close enough to a file system that the rest of the overhead of the POSIX file system layer isn't that significant until you try
It's,
to run LS on it.
Mhm.
yeah,
But
look, it may be like I think
having
I think that's quite possible. Anyways, like it's not necessarily close enough to a POSIX layer because it depends what semantics you want to support. If you want to be able to
exactly
say,
verbal
you know,
size,
Let him
this
finish.
is these are specific objects, and you have to know their address beforehand. And if you want to enumerate them, you have to manage your own index. You know, IES3 is what I'm talking about here. Then, like that would be relatively straightforward to build, and then you can also bring into that like atomicity guarantees that like the POSIX layer can't give you because it doesn't work that way.
yep,
So being able to say, well, this object does not exist until it is completed, and then it can't be modified under that. Like there's all sorts of stuff you could do. So yeah,
and creating groups of objects in one atomic change. Kind of, I need an object containing this content. Give me its name back, or a failure. And then you probably want a flat namespace of sorts so that you can find your roots. And then you're responsible for using these objects to build your own index or use an external index.
Yep. So these things are not difficult to. The details would be a pain, but
and as long as the objects aren't updatable, you would also make it a lot easier to do direct IO, I think, if it's only write, report success or error, or read or delete, no update, just you want to update something, use multiple objects and delete the old ones.
Yep. So yeah, the underlying APIs, the APIs inside ZFS, like these things are not especially complicated. But it's all use case. It's all going to be use case driven, really.
Like 2/3 of the layer, lower level of a file system layer.
Yeah, the file system layer is a pretty thin piece, relatively thin piece on top. That just translates
Let him
POSIX
finish,
into.
Jan.
Yeah, go on. I was going to say it just translates POSIX calls into the underlying object system inside ZFS.
Yep, but you may be able to get rid of at least one level of interaction if you have ZFS own the ID namespace, because the POSIX layer has to have some kind of per file system mapping from path to inode and then from inode to content, just so that the copy and write overhead isn't too ridiculous. Sometimes you have to add an extra level of interaction so that the effectively path copying overhead is not prohibitive. On the extreme end, you have purely name-based file system where basically the file content of all files exists in a single unified B tree or something. And those provide great benchmark results as long as you pick your benchmarks in favor, and then you do a bulk rename and everything stops. But sure, untowering a tarball is incredibly fast because it's basically sequential I/O at that point.
But you won't be because it's not implementing a whole file system. So
people have implemented research file systems, especially for Linux, in that way, and they provide great performance benefits, especially on spinning disks, because file system name locality now implies data locality and so on, but it's with some very common operations, especially moving directories containing lots of files, are ridiculously expensive because things which used to just update a reference now deep copy the whole subtree. And that's just not usable for common operations. It's not a general purpose file system at that point. But for an object store, if you are not allowed to rename stuff and aren't even allowed to pick your own names, you could remove one or two levels of interaction and support set operations and so on, which exist within ZFS and are used to implement that abstraction layer if I glanced at the code correctly, but aren't reachable from the ZFS file system layer. Some overhead you just can't cut out.
Okay. Is anyone familiar with the Lustre ZFS OSD? It's long fascinated me as a rip out the middle person,
I don't know
get
if
as
it
lower
was
level as you can, but
Yeah, well, it's I'm only familiar with it in that I know that it is a client of the ZFS internals, so I have to be careful when changing certain internal APIs and that sort of thing. But yeah, it does exactly that. It calls directly into the DMU.
is it a halfway decent reference for some of what we're describing? And if you want web dev that's directly to the DMU, you follow their model and you worry about the same upstream library issues
that
they've looked at.
yeah,
Let Rob address that as a
that
developer on hand.
I do that I don't know. I have not looked at it. It's kind of hard to figure out exactly where the canonical code for it is and how it works, but it's like it's a big clustered system, so it's kind of like I suspect it will have a lot of complexity that makes it hard as a sort of an example, but that doesn't mean it's not.
Right. And that's where a hello world example would be great insofar as we're exploring this chicken and egg issue of, well, no one's doing something like this because it's barely been done and we haven't focused on hooks for people to use it, even though obviously with what's on screen, one can go do it and roll their own. So for the long-term future, I think this is all worth exploring. What's been done, what we want, and opening up to the call. Does anyone have a wish list item like, oh, I wish my web dev was purely low-level ZFS? Go ahead, Jan.
Michael?
Yes.
Web dev is a very bad example because
it's a prompting example.
Web dev is not an object store.
It's not.
It's supposed to provide very much file system-like semantics, even somewhat richer than pure minimal POSIX file system implementations.
Oh, good to know. So how about S3?
So S3 is something else again.
I don't know what I'm going to argue with you here a little bit. I don't know what point you're making. It is a good example because it's a thing that people would use. Like I'm all for research and experiments and whatever. Those things are hugely important. But like, what are the gaps right now? Like, what are the things that people who have ZFS deployed are like? This is a pain in my ass because I have to run this, file system converter, which is what a web dev server is, to convert between POSIX. Like, if ZFS did it directly, does it already have the tools? Like, web dev has, checkout and commit semantics. It has patch semantics. Like, which things of those might be made easier if it only spoke directly to the DMU, and then I don't have another service to run. I don't have to worry about file system level breakage when I don't even give a shit about the file system, stuff like that. So that's why they're interesting.
I think what would be very useful to a bunch of applications is to add transaction semantics to the file system layer, because the common thing is that you want to create the temporary file, write something to it, rename it, and in between fsync multiple times. So first you have to fsync to make sure that the file under pure POSIX implementation is not allowed to disappear after you've created it, so that you persist it, you fsync the file and the containing directory. First transaction, basically. Next, you write to the file. Then you have to sync it again. Next transaction. Then you rename it. Next transaction, and so on, unless you merge those. But that requires a bunch of logic. If you could instead say, begin transaction for this thread, do a bunch of stuff in this thread, commit the thread, that would be the minimal change I see to extend this to the VFS by just adding basically 3 operations: begin, rollback, and commit.
Yep.
Or you would need a kind of list IO in the similar to what the underused, underspecified POSIX asynchronous I/O spec says, where you have this optional list I/O, and there you can do a bunch of operations. But the problem is this API is not designed to support operations which create new resources, like opening a file is not an asynchronous operation or creating one. Because unlike Linux with IOU ring, where you have a way to basically re-reserve a range of file descriptors and then have barriers in between so that you have a data flow representation of your operations. Yeah. And if I
Rob, you
remember
had
correctly, I
go
don't
ahead.
know if it's Gluster or Luster or either one of those two abandoned, more or less abandoned projects. One of them had a way to kind of access the DMU from userspace bypassing the normal dataset. But if I remember correctly from the slides they shared, which weren't going into too much of the detail, they kind of cheated by having an external index, because as a cluster file system, they already had a metadata server, and that metadata server was the distributed index.
Okay. So, Rob, you had what sounded like an on that point. Have you seen things that stood out?
Sorry, which point?
Oh,
There was a lot there.
the whole notion of adding just some simple transactional semantics to a file system layer.
Oh, right. Yes. So yeah, like so XFS is which is a Linux internal file system
Yep.
have just added, I
Yep.
think it may not even be shipped yet, 6.14 maybe, possible 6.13, but through they've added a couple of ioctls to be able to do transactional to be able to do a transactional change through your through the POSIX layer. So it effectively it's not quite named like that, but you effectively do a kind of you open the file, you kind of do it like a checkout on a range, and then you make modifications within that range, which are only kind of visible to you. And then you do a separate commit ioctl. If the underlying range has not changed, then your write goes in as sort of one operation. And if you don't do the commit, it gets disappeared. I'm sure there's more details than that. I've only read like the fluffy high level stuff and scanned the man page like once. So, but my point is more, those concepts are starting to appear. And
That sounds
other
like
file systems.
just opportunistic locking, no real locking. So you have to have a fallback path, which adds a lot of complexity, because you basically have to get it right twice.
I mean, it's true. Mandatory locking is quite difficult as well, and you usually want some coordination elsewhere.
It could be advisory, but this doesn't provide really locking. It just attempt to do this, and then it's as if you're using advisory locking with only non-blocking acquires. So you have to retry until you succeed if you only want to use this. And you can, if it's very contested, never make progress.
Sure. I mean, I don't, like I said, I don't know what you like. I'm not saying it's perfect or even that it's desirable. I'm just saying that these
it's
things
already useful.
Let him finish.
Are starting to just that it is starting to exist in other places. And yes, should we do something like that? I don't know, but it's got to be led by an application. Like, I'd love to see an application turn up and say, this is the thing I want, and if you put it in ZFS, we will use it. I'd be like, great, then let's go. But I'm not just going to build. I don't have time to build things speculatively, even though sometimes supply-led demand is a thing, but I don't have time. So
no more science than the science you've done to date. Go ahead, Jan.
As far as I know, there's a fairly active community of Postgres and ZFS users. And there are recommendations what you can safely get away with to improve throughput or latency on ZFS within Postgres, because certain things you don't have to deal with because ZFS provides atomic writes. There are no torn writes. You have stronger ordering guarantees than POSIX requires. So a bunch of the paranoia Postgres has to do on an arbitrary file systems can be disabled. But there are some things you cannot express where Postgres has to do things slower. But if we have the right APIs, they may be able to not have to do data journaling because DFS already does it.
Right. Why do that twice? Yeah.
I didn't try to do any serious optimization of it, but I have run Postgres on Illumos on ZFS, obviously.
Anything exotic, or just go with the public suggestions and let it rip?
Mostly just the public suggestions, and they have packages for all of the major release versions of ZFS in their extras repository.
Cool.
But if we have this kind of transactions which can be aborted for big enough data, you could have something like SQLite or Postgres or some other real-world database application basically get rid of all the write amplification a transactional database normally has to do. SQLite is probably the simplest use case because it's single file.
That's what I was actually going to suggest as well, because since SQLite is a fairly small version of it, or of an SQL database, adapting that to take advantage of this sounds like a great idea.
Well, could you do a ZFSQL, a super lightweight front end that just says, hey, nearly everything gets handed over there. We do our
but
other databasey stuff with something off the shelf. Go ahead.
Using SQLite as a starting point for that is really good for a number of reasons. Notably the licensing concern.
Correct.
SQLite has the advantage of being public domain. So there is no licensing concern there.
But
because there is no license.
Very strict about accepting contributions, as in they basically don't.
This is true.
If you look it up, so ever getting that upstreamed would be hard. Of course, you are allowed to maintain your fork.
Yeah, it would probably be a fork.
But it may be possible because the SQLite has its own virtual file system layer so that you can use it for embedded systems to map it to like all of your normal.
You cut out again horribly.
Yeah.
You cut out
again for a moment.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me again?
Yes, my hope with all this is to get some shower thoughts going, to just get some aha moments from all of you. So vocalizing it is always valuable, even if it's crazy ideas like WebDAV on top of SQLite on top of ZFS. But anyway, anything more to discuss here, or take it to the back of your head, your subconscious? Yes, Rob.
I'll say I just one more thing. Usually when this conversation comes up within the ZFS sort of developer communities, it's about having a user space send receive, user space snapshot receiver sender, whatever. The idea is saying, like, if you were running a backup service, so like say a an rsync.net, where you want to receive streams but all you want to do is store them, there is no
untrusted streams.
Yeah, and you're never going to mount them either. Then there's no particular reason to actually have them in the kernel. And so if you could just have it in a user space daemon and it can just receive and write them out to these or block devices, whatever. And that's kind of the end of it. It happily runs in user space. It has all the nice user space things like like it can crash and be restarted. It can have its monitoring and then whatever else, and you just run it like an application. And that has been written 2 or 3 times, as far as I'm aware, in the last decade or so.
Did anyone get it right and in a public manner?
I don't I don't know about public. I know one of them was done by Alan Jude and Pavel Dudek.
Oh yeah.
So
Yep.
it's probably not terrible. But I
Yeah,
don't know
exactly.
but it was years and years ago, so I don't know if it's a bit rotten now or if they even still have it. I've only heard stories in the pub.
Oh.
So so yeah,
Okay.
but like there are many interesting applications available to a user space CFS, I think.
It's not
Amen. Go ahead, Andrew.
it's not quite a untrusted scenario because it's an internal setup, but I actually have a setup where I have a bunch of different kinds of client machines feeding data over a completely isolated network into a single giant backup host. And then based on the customer, it runs a separate, I think it's set up to use a separate Illumos zone
Hmm.
for each customer so that hypothetically, and the level, the stuff over there is insane how separated that is, but hypothetically, even if someone accessed one zone, they can't see anything in the other. So there's that.
There's that. Daniel Bell was looking quite a bit into this, and just, a customer might be a known customer or a commodity off the shelf coin operated stranger, and you do not want hostile input at a low level, like at the file system level. Jan, you had your hand up. Any last points on this?
SQLite already has a VSS for
Yeah.
POSIX. Ah,
So there already are multiple virtual file systems for SQLite, one for Windows, one for POSIX, one for POSIX without flog, but using instead log files like you have to do over old-fashioned NFS v3 without the logging protocol running. And yeah, it works. And you can write your own implementation without having to patch SQLite because it's just fill in the struct of callback function and give it to the SQLite open v3 or v4 or whatever API.
Cool.
And so it would be a good starting point. And
yeah, that's what I was
SQLite
gonna
is
Great
speeding
say.
up
example.
so much
Love it.
that a lot of applications would automatically profit from just telling them, here, link against this library, change the one function call in the setup, and SQLite becomes a lot faster.
You have a link for that? Just some Hello World example?
And I am stuck on a phone.
Okay, cool.
Sorry for that.
No
You're
worries at
cutting out
all.
too, so I
Yeah,
sometimes
I hear you.
don't hear
Or don't hear
someone
you, but I'm bummed.
starting in time.
Okay, so Stu, you've rolled in, Steve, Greg, all the classic users in Hollywood, etc. Do you have any topics, questions, ideas, concerns, follow-ups, funny jokes?
Another ad for the locking. Um,
Yes, please.
we have to run software to make AVID happy for bin locking. That could be very easily solved by ZFS. There's a example for you, Rob.
I am interested, as in I would like to ask Tommy more about that, but I also have talked a lot in this call and don't want to clog it up. So
Oh, dude,
yeah.
you are the resident developer, so it's your call more than it's our call. But anyway, Stu, can you name a third-party piece of software that costs probably over $20 a year?
It's per seat.
EER.
Let me look.
Sure, thank you.
It's not horrendous, but it's just one of those annoying things. At least
Fair enough.
in the media realm, some customers have 100 workstations that each one of them would need it for it to work for one.
And I do not know to what degree we consider Avid a legacy app, but given that's been carried forward from the 90s and it was probably 32-bit, they've slowly evolved it. And if you look at things like QuickBooks, it's like they've not changed much. And here we are putting them in modern environments. So I don't know if Avid is okay. Hedge.
Mimic.
Cool. Thank you.
was right on top of my tongue, but Slack saved me.
Yay, thank you, Slack.
I didn't ask AI, so that's where all the
Hmm.
answers are anymore.
Not on this call. So, and you say you could need 100 workstations with such a thing, and some amount of money adds up. May need.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that lower friction to get on onto the storage, makes for
That's slow.
happier customers.
Hmm. Rob, don't hold back on questions for Stu on that topic. You seem intrigued.
Um, I will. No, I have no questions right now. I have opened the links and I will have a look. Bin
Oh,
locking is a brand new term of art for me, so I will have to go and understand what that is. I can kind of guess, but yeah,
At one point,
interesting.
and
at
think
one point,
collaborative work, etc. Go ahead.
yeah, at one point, Samba was working on something, and I hacked a couple things toward it, and it never was truly successful. But we might be able to just pass it through.
Hmm, fascinating. All right.
And
I
this,
wonder,
go ahead.
I wonder if having file system level transactions would also allow SQLite to gain true concurrent write support. And that would be a killer feature to anyone wanting to use it on the server side.
Give it what support? Concurrent something?
So right now, by default, SQLite either supports one writer or multiple readers.
Ah,
And if you add writer head logging, you can have one writer and multiple readers at the same time. But you cannot have multiple concurrent writers, even if you're writing to different tables and so on.
oh, interesting.
And that's kind of one of the big scalability limits of SQLite, that it does not support multiple concurrently open write transactions. But if the transactions are implemented in the file system layer below, maybe it would make it pretty easy to allow it to effectively run concurrent write transactions. And that would allow people to not just run SQLite for little test deployments or low user count deployments, but you could just use it.
Right. Before I forget, question everyone, is this a completely false memory of mine? There was mention of file level snapshotting or sometime over the last 10 years. Does that ring any bells?
It
Did I
doesn't with
hear an
me.
Eva? I heard a quiet Eva. No worries. Um, and broadly on all of these topics, I picture universities around the world with September CS 201, where it's like, let's write a front end using this back end. Well, the better the back end, the more creative people can get on the front end. So thank you very much for exploring this. Daniel Bell, welcome. You have joined, and I hope you caught that little bit we had about the user space, ZFS for services, working with perhaps untrusted incoming backups, etc. There was mention of an Allen PGA D1 of maybe 3 to date. Do you have any status report on that?
Well, I was talking to Pavel about this. We sent some emails back and forth, and I think he was embroiled in his what do you call it? The the block
Oh,
what do you
block
call
cloning.
block cloning. So
Yeah.
yeah, so I think so I probably owe him an email on this, but I've been just doing it in a VM, so sort of ZFS inception, which is fine, but if it was user land, it would be better. Um, yeah, the interesting thing in my discussions with him are, that there are some there are some bugs, some, like you can have a like a really nasty uh um resume token that could potentially do some damage to a system. So it is probably necessary for ZFS to become the sort of default standard without a separate API in order to replicate to an untrusted source. Um, so yeah, until then, for certain applications, I just do it, do a zVol and a VM, which everybody tells you not to do, but it works great. So
There you go.
yeah, the way Pavel put it is that ZFS receive is dumb. So I mean, I can't read the code, so I don't know enough to say it, but I know enough to trust him to if
A
both
non-ambiguous
ends
statement.
if yeah, both ends aren't controlled by me, then
Mhm.
I want to put a wrapper around it.
Do you have any topics, Daniel?
No, no, not too much. I haven't really played with the new I was hilariously excited about the JSON output because I wanted to, you know, sort of backport that into my own replication scripts. Also, my own replication scripts are very much due for a polish because I have a half a dozen features that are, you know, uh on my fleet, but not ready for the public. So I've got to get that tuned up. It's been a while.
I am selfishly looking if ZFS is updated in FreeBSD ports such that one can just drop in the latest goodies.
So while we're wishing for things,
Yes.
if ZFS had support for subscribing to persistent file change notifications and special acceleration for recursive copy on write of directories or single files, which copy file range already does, that would make it possible to vastly accelerate large monorepo operations like on the FreeBSD ports tree or bigger. For example, Microsoft wrote a virtual file system in direction of kind of Fuse for Windows stuff, where they are using the equivalent of a Fuse server to get all the writes to the mount point so that they can uh, not scan their giant internal monorepos. I assume Google has done something else. Meta has their file watcher with iNotify, which doesn't really scale. Uh, Normally, POSIX file systems don't provide this. macOS has it for HFS Plus and AppFS, but ZFS could quite easily grow that because it would be similar to ZFS diff with a just continuous diff, basically. Take the starting snapshot as a point, uh, and then tell me everything which changed on this subdirectory would really help with Git status. And Git already has a mechanism where you have like a changed file notification helper. So the moment that feature exists and someone has written the little glue command, Git operations on really big histories would become a lot faster, especially things that just Git status, which would
Think,
help a bunch of organizations with very big repositories.
Thinking back to mailders and A-time on FreeBSD, would that allow one to look at that A-time requirement in a different light for mail notifications?
If you rewrite the way the mail command filters if that mailbox is unread or not, then yes. Otherwise, no. So yeah, it would have to be a change to how the mail command reads its mbox, because Mailia has the hack which is required to work over NFS by encoding the flags into the mail name, so that you have like 3 directories for each mailbox, one for temporary, new, and deleted stuff. And then you rename them, and to change a fixed set of flags, you have single letter status flags in the path name, because file renames are atomic even on NFS, so that you could read your mails via NFS on a campus network without a log server. But that's, yeah. So for our Mailia, it's a solved problem. It just means that Mailia is a bit ugly to look at.
Cool.
For mailbox, so just concatenating all the messages in a single file and using the A time to see if you have new messages, and if those messages have been read. So basically, is M time and A time identical or not?
Oh,
Then yeah, that could be improved on. Or you can just make var mail its own file system and enable A time only for that.
as they do, which inspired that. Well, anyway, does anyone else have topics, or have we adequately explored the high level dreams we have? Though Britt talking about exercising JSON output is definitely right down to the bare metal and stuff we have now. No wishing necessary. Eva, you are the one person not on mute. Any topics, any questions? Or rephrased, would you like the honors? No mic. All right, everyone. Well, like and subscribe. I'll stick around a few minutes.